Hello! Today I'm continuing my celebration of Final Fantasy VIII, and moving chronologically through the main party now, I'm going to kick off with a short discussion on Quistis. And to prefix this consideration of the orphans that comprise our main party, it's worth noting that each of them, Quistis, Zell, Selphie, and Irvine, all have a micro-story that hinges around a dichotomy of character and a false sense of self that they've each constructed for themselves. And it contrasts with, and seeks to cover up, some deep-seated insecurities, perhaps stemming from their rootless status as orphans, and I'll touch on this shortly. And I mention this now because it becomes something that each of them has to reconcile with, at various stages of the game, and I think Quistis is a prime example of this, kicking off with her. So, following on from this point, it's also worth prefixing the discussion of the main party by acknowledging that Final Fantasy VIII was criticised by some for what was considered a lack of character development and exploration of these characters. And unlike preceding games, such as Final Fantasy VII, which had side quests and locations dedicated to understanding our disparate group, such as Cosmo Canyon, Corel, Wutai, and Rocket Town, Final Fantasy VIII's close-knit group, who originate in the same place, left little scope for exploration outside of the core story. So I can understand why some people didn't like this, as collecting strange new characters from around the world is an interesting and enjoyable experience in the Final Fantasy series. However, owing to Final Fantasy VIII's dense and complex themes, which centre around characters who are disparate chronologically rather than geographically, with the story focusing on two parties across Laguna's past and Squall's present, there was obviously less scope to explore various sprawling stories without diluting the potency and the cohesive structure of the central story, across these two timelines. And that said, we do get to explore certain locations, such as Balam, Timber, Galbadia, and Trabia, which are each tied to certain character stories, albeit in a slightly more abbreviated and less involved way. Looping back around to Quistis now, she kicks off the story as the first party member we acquire, and is rooted to the world of Balam Garden as a high-flying student-turned-instructor. The second FMV of the game is dedicated to her sigh of disapproval as she collects Squall from the infirmary, and her initial role is helping contextualise Squall's introverted personality by trying to periodically elicit an emotional response from him, along with onboarding us into the game mechanics as a mentor figure. Regarding the first point, from the moment we leave the infirmary, the dynamic between Squall and Quistis is explored, as Quistis states that she's beginning to understand him a little more, and mimics his response of whatever to exemplify the point. She also helps establish the existent rift between Squall and Seifer by comparing their qualities, such as mentioning how they're in a league of their own when we're venturing through the fire cavern with her. And she also remarks upon their competitiveness, which, off the back of the opening FMV, really helps frame this widening conflict between them that obviously blows up as the game wears on and Seifer turns coat to Sorceress Adia. Regarding the second point, Quistis is very much a utilitarian character early on, and as an instructor, she onboards us to the game mechanics such as junctioning, magic, and miscellaneous battle commands, and through her assumed knowledge and authority in these early stages, it's interesting to see the development of her character during later stages, particularly regarding Squall and her diminishing status as a mentor. Now, as I touched on earlier and in previous discussions of Final Fantasy VIII, the main party each start off in a sort of fabricated persona to conceal certain insecurities about themselves. Regarding Quistis, she's introduced as this knowledgeable teacher right from the get-go, guiding Squall from the infirmary to the classroom, and, through these onboarding sequences, such as the fire cavern. Additionally, her disciplining of Seifer following the seed exam shows this sense of authority and this idea of Quistis, being, for all intents and purposes, in charge. This facade quickly unravels when, following the graduation ceremony, Squall accompanies Quistis to the training centre, and she proceeds to unburden all of her insecurities, ineptitudes, and recent dismissal as an instructor on him, indicating that the Quistis we've come to know so far isn't quite what we expected her to be, and indeed she is quite the opposite of the self-assured teacher she is initially established as. Another pressing element of her confession, which Squall duly thinks to himself while she's talking to him, is, "Why are you telling me this?" And this relates to her emotional confusion regarding Squall and forms another aspect of insecurity which she seeks to reconcile with during the game events. From the outset, and with the benefit of hindsight, we can see how Quistis goes through the motions of trying to elicit an emotive response from Squall. In the opening moments of the game, we walk down a corridor from the infirmary with Quistis and witness two students giggling at them in the background. And this is the point at which Quistis claims she's been trying to understand him a little more. Shortly afterwards in the fire cavern, she notes how students often get nervous in her presence, perhaps in an attempt to elicit jealousy or a hint of attraction from Squall. And finally, in the moment we're discussing now, at the training centre, she starts unloading all of her issues onto him in a somewhat misjudged idea that he would console or even care about her problems. To this end, Quistis is a pretty interesting character and has an interesting personal journey through the game, which is often glimpsed when speaking to her at non-essential intervals and narrative reprieves in the core story. And a prime example is at the orphanage, around midway through the game. She's staring out across the ocean, privately reconciling with her issues, and realises that she's been labouring under a false impression of Squall, and indeed her own feelings, which she mistook for romance and love, but now reconsiders as a possible residue of her big sisterly days at the orphanage. This is a prime example of the facade and unresolved feelings that many of the orphan characters progress through the game with, and I'll get into their respective episodes, later, but it's perhaps more poignantly witnessed in Quistis because she's introduced to us, in the opening moments of the game, as such a strong and assertive personality. So has a much more obvious transition across the first few discs as she kind of unravels slightly and shows these cracks in her facade and insecurities. Now, delving a little deeper and looking at some of the intricacies of Quistis' character, she has a couple of interesting moments that augments her personality, and while her big sister mentor side sees her pragmatically looking after people for the most part, she can also come across slightly patronising at times, particularly with regards to Rinoa. With the benefit of hindsight, we might assume this extends in part from jealousy over Squall, and indeed, as soon as the excellent Waltz for the Moon FMV finishes, we encounter Quistis, who says something along the lines of, "Even that dance was perfect." And even though we're just reading text on a screen, we can almost hear the insolent tone with which she delivers that line. Her misgivings about Rinoa are outrightly addressed during the assassination mission, where, despite everyone gearing up for a decisive military encounter with potentially huge geopolitical repercussions, Rinoa is chatting about the Odin bangle and naively trying to convince others that she has an alternative plan. And at this point Quistis snaps and comprehensively shuts Rinoa down with blunt authority that could be considered as channeling some of her jealousy, or at the very least shows the more patronising side of her teacherly big sister qualities. And digressing slightly, it's interesting to note how Quistis expresses obvious anger to only a couple of people in the game, two of which are Rinoa and Seifer. And thinking about this, I find it interesting how Rinoa and Seifer are actually quite similar in some respects, with both being impulsive, naive, and being led by their emotions, much more than characters such as Squall, for example. And although it's an unseen portion of the game story, it seems obvious how Seifer and Rinoa would have hit it off and blossomed a sort of romance that leads towards, Rinoa's introduction to Sid in the game events, because they're both idealistic and slightly off-the-wall characters compared to those around them. And by comparison, it's amusing how Squall and Quistis are actually at the other end of this spectrum, with both operating with a quiet reserve and pragmatism, unwilling to address their emotions and desires publicly. And for Squall's part, I've discussed his demeanour in my Squall episode, but it's prudent to consider how Quistis is slightly older than her peers and in a position of leadership, which makes it harder for her to emote with those around her, because of course showing insecurity can compromise authority. And unfortunately for Quistis, when she finally does muster the confidence to open up, Squall doesn't really care that much. Now, before I wrap up on Quistis, I'd like to note that firstly, despite her sincerity and reserved nature, she does have a quick wit and some funny moments as a party member throughout the game, which I actually didn't discover for a number of years, because as a youth I simply didn't have her in my party that much. And perhaps another discussion for another day is how our ideas and perceptions of certain characters shifts over time with our own growth and maturity, which I think is quite interesting. But regarding Quistis, if you're into the side quests of Final Fantasy VIII, and particularly the card club, which is a cool one, we find Quistis is actually a notorious card shark and holds the rank of king within the card club, who we have to defeat as a part of this side quest adventure. Quistis also shows her penchant for humour during the game events, as doing the side quest in the Windhill Mansion sees her pretending to be a haunted suit of armour searching for its feet, which is also a pretty funny Easter egg. And finally, she has the borderline inappropriate fan club at Barlam Garden, who frequently pine over her and exhibit jealousy over Squall's close proximity to her, which is another funny, kind of amusing element to Quistis' inclusion. So, finally, wrapping up now, Quistis is aesthetically interesting, and another early character teased in the concept art prior to the game's release. For some reason, her character portrait faces right, while everyone else's face is left, but beyond this, she also slots into a trope of Japanese media, which is wearing glasses equals intelligence and quiet pragmatism. And in Final Fantasy specifically, the most recent parallel is Ignis from Final Fantasy XV, with whom Quistis shares some personality traits and visual traits too, I think. But, this is a prevalent aesthetic trope across anime and manga that I thought was quite interesting to note here. So that about wraps up my thoughts on Quistis. She has an intriguing transition across the core game events, and is a prime example of the orphan characters grappling with insecurities before reconciling with their true selves. I'll be working through the remaining party members soon, so if you enjoyed the episode, please like and subscribe to keep updated with my future posts, and feel free to drop a comment and start a conversation to share your thoughts.